Hello guys, welcome back to another tutorial on .NET Web APIs. So today I'll be covering up another crucial topic, which is exception handling or error handling. Okay, so in any enterprise application, it's very important to handle errors gracefully so that the application does not crash. Okay, so what I'll be covering today is global error handling, and I'll be using an approach wherein I'll be using a error endpoint. Okay, and I'll also be showing you the concept of problem details. Okay, let's get started. So I'll just open my existing application, API application. Let's go to the company's controllers. Okay, and I have the get companies endpoint here. Let me just go ahead and just throw an exception here. So new exception. I'll just call it as a test exception. Okay. And let's try to execute this and see how the response is coming up. Okay. So let's try to access Swagger endpoint API documentation. Yeah. So now when I execute the company's endpoint, if you see, I'm getting a 500 server error. Okay, it is throwing an exception, but this is a very inconvenient way wherein a person or a developer who is consuming the API can use this information, because if you see the content type, it's in text plain. Okay, so there is a better way wherein we can respond with errors in the system or the application so that any developer who is consuming the API can use it. And for that, .NET has a standard way of doing it, and that's called problem details. Okay, so problem details is nothing but it's a specific standard which .NET has. I'll just show it to you now. So it's a standardized way of representing errors in web APIs. Okay, so there's a RFC 7807 standard for that. Let me just bring that up. So if you see this is the RFC document, RFC 7807. So this is the problem details object. So it has properties like type, title, details, and instance. Okay. So type is basically a URI, which points you to exact error. Okay. Now there's also a title. So title is like it's like a short human readable summary, but it's unique to that particular error. Detail can be a detailed description of that error, but this needs to vary on every instance of that error. For example, if you can see here, the title says you do not have enough credit. So if there are two instances of this error, the title would remain the same. That is, it would be you do not have enough credit, but the details can change. So one time the detail can be your balance is 30, but the cost is 50. And on the second instance, it can be your current balance is 20. Okay. Now, instance is basically, again, a URI, which will specifically point you to that place where the error has occurred. Okay. And apart from this, there's also another property called status, which is nothing but the status code, HTTP status code. And you can also have additional extensions. So in the problem details object, apart from these default properties, you can add in extensions so that to aid the developer who is consuming it. So instead of just specifying the current balance and costs inside the details string, so if the developer wants to use these values, he just has to parse this string. So instead of that, we can just provide it as properties with as extension properties. Okay. So now let's see how we can use that. Okay. So for using that, what I'll first do is I will uh, use an approach of global error handling, and that is using an error endpoint. So for that, what we'll first do is let's go to the program .cs file, and I'll just add an entry here. So just before use HTTPS redirection, let's add this app dot use exception handler. Use exception handler, and let's call it as error. Let's call it as error. So what this will do is it will add a middleware in the pipeline that will catch exceptions, log them, and reset the request path to this new request path. So for that, we'll create a controller endpoint. So all the errors which are occurring in your entire API, there will be a hit to the error endpoint of the error controller. Okay. So let's go ahead and create the error controller now. So if we go to controllers and just create the error controller class, add new class. Let's call it as error controller. We'll call it as public sealed error controller. Let's inherit from controller base. Okay. Now here, let's create an endpoint called error. So let's first add a route and call the route as /error. So since we specified it here, every time there's an exception in our application, the error endpoint in this particular controller will hit. Let's create that endpoint. So we'll call it as public action result error. So this endpoint will hit every time there's an exception. So what we'll do is we'll return problem details from here. So the way you have to return is problem. We just return it as problem. So you can directly return it, but there's a way of specifying what status code. So the property status code, let's say this is 500. Okay. So now let's try to run our code with exception again here. So exception. Let's call it as this is a test exception. Okay, now let me run it, and I'll just put a breakpoint here to show you when the exception occurs. This breakpoint should be hit. So if we go to the API now, API documentation. Okay, and if I just go to companies and I run the endpoint, you see, since it has hit this and it has got the exception, now it will hit the error endpoint. And let's see what the output is now. So now if you see, we have a sleek JSON response, and this, if you see, it is called, the content type is not text. It's not application text. You see the content type, it's called problem JSON. So it returns your problem JSON, and these are the properties: type and title. Status is 500, which we have returned, and this is the trace ID. And as I've shown you, you can also add extension properties, which are your custom properties. So now let's go to this. So this is the RFC URL which it is giving. So if I just go ahead and put it here, so this is the RFC standard document where it will point me to. So since it is error 500, it points me to this. So this is the RFC document which has all the errors which could possibly occur in an API or HTTPS or HTTP API. So that's the RFC standard. So that's the URL, so that any developer who is consuming the API is clear about what the error is all about. Then you have a title, you can have details. So this was just basic instance of problem which I've called. So let's go ahead and create a detailed response. So if you see, we have thrown an exception here, but that details of that exception should reach here. So for that, what we'll do is we'll just catch the exception here. So in this, we will say HTTP context.features.get exception handler, and we'll get the error or exception. Okay. And then here, what we can do is, along with status code, we can also add the title exception.message. So now if we run, we should get this message. API documentation. Let me go ahead and run this. So now if you see, the title says this is the test exception. That's our custom exception. Okay. So now the other thing is, we have this already implemented in .NET, but the way I prefer to use it is using custom problem details factory, so that we can add our extension properties to it. So for doing that, what I'll do is I'll create a new class called problem details factory. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So let me go to domain exceptions. Yeah, so let's move to API. I will just create a new folder here called common. Let's create a new folder called common exceptions. New folder called exceptions. And here I'll create a new class called custom problem details factory. Custom problem details factory. Okay. And now what we can do is the default code for this is already available on GitHub, so we can just pick it up from there. So if you see here in GitHub, if you just type in default problem details factory, it gives you the entire source code. So we'll just copy that and then we'll go ahead and modify it according to our needs. So if I take this from here, I'll just copy the entire code. And just paste it here and change the name to this. Let me create this. Let me go ahead and create this. Let me see what I'm missing here. Yeah, so this needs to inherit from problem details factory. Okay, once you've done that, we are good to go here. So now if we need to add any additional extension properties, we can do it here. So if you see here, it's problem details dot extension. That is how we are getting the trace ID. So if you need to add any custom properties in your problem details object, we can do it here. We can just say problem details dot extensions dot add custom property. I'll just call it as custom property just for the sake of demo, and custom property value. So this is how we can then add our custom properties. Okay, so now let's try and run the whole thing. We should get the new custom property which we have added. So when we run the get companies endpoint, it will throw an exception, then it will be caught by the error out, and it will return the problem details object. If we come here, execute this, and here we get the details. Oh, so we haven't got it. So let's check what we have missed here. Yes. So we have missed one thing here is that we need to register that. So if we just go to dependency injection, so we forgot to just register the problem details, custom problem details factory. So I'll just go to configuration, dependency injection, and I will just configure it as singleton. So just so unit of work, so just paste in this. So if you see, add singleton problem details factory, custom problem details factory. Okay, so now if I run this, we should get our custom properties and custom value in the trace object, in the problem details object. You just go to API documentation, and let's try to execute this. Yeah, so if you see here now, we have also a custom property in the problem details object. Okay, so now how to actually use it when we are developing, or how to actually raise exceptions in a particular business logic. So this was just a test exception I have shown you. So let me go ahead and show you how we can use it. For the for the sake of this tutorial, I'll be just showing you to raise exceptions from the controller. But as we move to further tutorials, I'll be having another tutorial which will be covering up how to avoid fat controllers. So there are a lot of things in the controller. So controller will just be delegating to internal business logic layers. So if you want to raise exceptions from those layers, also it should be possible. So for that, what I'll be going with you now is flow control. So it is very important to have a proper flow control when there is exception occurring. Okay, so we'll cover that now. So if you see here, so from the last tutorial, another thing which I have already done here is, uh, let's go to the database. So I've added another stored procedure called sp does record exist. So another dynamic stored procedure called sp does record exist. What this does is takes in the table name, takes in two params, distinguishing unique key column name and distinguishing unique key column value. So a table can have multiple unique key columns, but to identify uh, whether a record is duplicate or no, we just need one distinguishing unique key column. So that's why I'm using that. Mostly it will be a name or title property. And then it is just checking whether there is a duplicate existing or no. Okay, so then I've also created another attribute called distinguishing unique key attribute on the property, so that in the models we can add them. So if I go to company model, I have already added the distinguishing unique key to the name property. Similarly for the employees model also, I've added it on the name property. Okay, and also we've added unique constraints in the table. So if I go to SQL table, we've added a unique key constraint on the name. Okay. So now what we'll do is, if you see this, I've added this another statement here. So this is how it is checking whether the unique whether the record is already existing or no. So when I try to add a company, if the name is already existing, it is just returning the conflict, that is 409 status. Okay, so if I go to the repositories, infrastructure, generic repository, so we've added another method in the generic repository, which is called is existing async, and it is just taking the value of distinguishing unique key column. Okay, and the way it is implemented is it's the similar way wherein it is calling the dynamic stored procedure, passing in the values, and to pass in the values here, it is getting the table name. And there's also another method which I've added to the extensions, which is get distinguishing unique key name. That is, if we go to application and extensions, we'll find it here. So it is just getting the properties which has the distinguishing unique key attribute name set, and then getting the name of it. Okay. Yeah. So the point of explaining this is, since we are now inside the controller, we can use these object results, that is conflict, error, etc. But as the application goes increases, and also in the further tutorials we'll be covering up how to avoid fat controller. So in that case, you should be in a position to throw an exception from anywhere, any layer in your API and not just the controllers. So let's go ahead and uh, change this. So instead of conflict, we'll be using a custom exception. Okay. For that, what we'll be doing is I will just go to application layer. So let's just go to application, common, and let's create a folder called exceptions. Okay, let's add a new class. Let's call it as duplicate company exception. Let me call this as duplicate company exception. So what I'll do is call it public and inherit from exception. And let me pass the exception to the main. So I'm taking in the error message and passing it to the base exception. Okay. Another thing which I would do here is go to I'll go to interfaces. I'll create another folder called exceptions and create an interface called I application exception so that we know which are the exceptions which are generated by the exception by the application. Add a new item. Let me add a new interface. Call it I application exception. Okay, so once that's done, let's remove this. And here what I'll be implementing is basically I'll have HTTP status code and error message. HTTP status code and the error message. Okay. And let's also inherit from I application exception. And let's implement this interface here. So what I will do is status code will be HTTP status code dot conflict because this is for duplicate company. And the error message will be message. So it will just throw the message. Okay, so we have our class ready. So similarly, we can also have another class for say not found exception. Okay, so let's try the duplicate company exception first. And now in our the error controller, what we can do here is we can just generalize it so that exceptions, any type of exception, as well as an unhandled exception is handled properly and appropriate messages are given here. Okay, so for that, let's add a switch statement. So let me just add a switch statement here. where status code and message equal to exception switch. Yeah, so this is a new way of a new syntax of switch. So what I'll take it as is I application exception. So the interface which we have just created. So if there's any I application exception, that is app exception, what I'll do is I will convert the status code to int. So here what I'll do is I'll say app exception dot status code. I'll convert it to int and app exception dot message, error message. So what it will do is if there's any exception which is inheriting I application exception. So in our case, it is duplicate company exception. There can be other exceptions as well, like not found company exception, which are inheriting from I application exception. So all the applications which inherit from this interface can be handled here. So they'll be giving the status code and the error message here. And if it is unhandled, that is, so the default switch case. So in the new syntax, to mention the default switch case, you just have the underscore. The default switch case, it will be, the status code would be status code dot codes dot status 500 internal server error. And we can just have a message and unexpected error occurred. Okay. So in case of any unhandled exception or unexpected error, it will come to the default route or default switch case. If not, and if it is any custom application error, exception or error, it will come to this place and give the proper status code, which is mentioned here, and the particular message which we have, which we'll be calling when creating the instance of the particular exception class. Okay, so since we are set here, now the only thing which we need to do is return this as a status code and message. Okay. Yeah, so once that's done, so now we go to company's controller, and instead of using the conflict, so what I'll do is I'll check for duplicates. If there's a duplicate, I'll throw the custom duplicate company exception. Instead of using this conflict and using this, the new duplicate company exception. And let me add this here. Yeah, so new duplicate company exception. and not return. You just need to throw the exception. Okay. We will throw the exception, duplicate company exception, and I'm putting a message company with the name company request already exists. Okay. Now if we run this and let me check the database on which companies do we have. So if I see, we already have a company called Software Development Limited. So let's copy that name and try to insert that. And let's start the API. Go to API documentation and try to post the company. So I'll just call it with the same name. Call it Nashville Tennessee USA. So when I try to execute this, it gives me an exception. So it gives me the problem details object. So it gives me the type, and type this time it is pointing to a proper URL. So let's copy this and check what it is pointing to. If you see, it will point us to conflict, that is 409, that which means there is a duplicate entry. So the entry for this particular name already exists. That is, and in the title, it gives us whatever custom error which we gave, that is company with the name Software Development Limited already exists, gives the status code 409, and also if there are any custom properties which we have added using the custom problem details factory, it is giving us that. Okay, so so the main advantage of doing this is since so we can call this from any of the layers and it would give, or it would take the same flow. Okay, so just to give you another example, it so to show you that it is using the same flow, let's create another class here for company not found exception, and instead of using this not found, let's use that exception. So let me just create another class. I'll call it company not found exception. Company not found exception. Call it public field. We'll inherit it from exception. Also inherit from I application exception. To implement the interface, let's call this as status codes dot not found is 404. So not found, an error message, we'll just return the message which is being passed. And before doing that, I think we'll need to have a constructor in place wherein the message from the company not found exception class is passed to the base exception. Okay, so once we are good to go here, so now what we'll do is we'll just remove this and we'll throw the exception. Throw new exception, not found exception. So let me just also add a proper message for that. So throw new company not found exception. The system does not have any company with the ID so and so. Okay. So now let me show you. We've just added another class here. We've not changed anything else. We've not changed this at all. So you can keep on adding multiple exceptions and it would take the same flow. So that's how we have a proper flow for your exception handling, global exception handling, wherein all your exceptions will be flowing through the same path. Okay, so let me just go ahead and find this, take a company ID which does not exist. So if I see this company ID is existing, so it is giving me the details. So now if I just change this to H, I should get not found. So if you see, I'm getting my problem details JSON here, and I'm getting all the properties properly. So this time it is giving me a URL, which I suppose should point to 404 in the RFC 7231 document. So if you see, it is pointing me to 404, which can aid any consumer of the web API. So it is giving us a custom message as well. The system does not have any company with ID so and so. Then it is giving us the status code as well as any custom properties if you have. Okay, so this was all about this tutorial on global error handling. So this is the way which I usually use, that is using the error endpoint and problem details factory. There's another way which I use, that is using a third-party library called error. So I will be covering that up when we'll move to other tutorial sessions, which shows you how to avoid fat controllers. So most of the pieces from the controller will be moving into inner layers of our application. And that time I will also introduce you to error, which is another way of basically giving flow direction to your applications. Okay, so that's it from this tutorial. Bye-bye.